Imagine descending into a tunnel every morning, knowing the mountain above you is alive, breathing, groaning, waiting. Imagine kissing your family goodbye and walking into the dark, not knowing if you will ever see daylight again. This was not a nightmare. This was Tuesday morning, October 14th, 1913, in the small Welsh mining village of Senghenydd. In a matter of seconds, the earth swallowed 439 men and boys whole. One explosion, one community, one of the deadliest industrial disasters in British history, and almost no one talks about it. This channel exists to shine a light on the stories history forgot, the workers, the families, the unheard voices buried beneath statistics and silence. Stay with us, because what happened beneath the hills of Wales deserves to be remembered, and the people responsible deserve to be known. Long before the disaster, Senghenydd was just a quiet valley in the Arbor Valley of South Wales. Surrounded by green hills and grey skies, it was the kind of place where generations of the same family lived, worked, and died within a few miles of each other. Coal had been discovered beneath this region in the late 19th century, and with it came the Universal Colliery, a pit sunk deep into the earth to extract the black gold that powered the British Empire. The village grew up around the colliery almost organically. Streets of terraced stone houses appeared, chapels were built, children were born and raised, knowing their fathers and brothers would one day descend into the same dark tunnels. By 1913, Senghenydd had become entirely dependent on the mine. It wasn't just an employer, it was the heartbeat of everything. The shops, the churches, the schools, the community. All of it existed because of the coal beneath their feet. And that coal, while it gave life, was slowly laying the groundwork for catastrophe. Not all coal mines are equal. The Universal Colliery at Senghenydd was particularly dangerous because of its geology. The coal seams ran deep and were rich in methane gas, what miners called fire damp. This invisible, odorless gas seeped continuously through cracks in the rock and collected in pockets throughout the tunnels. One spark, one poorly ventilated shaft, one faulty lamp, and fire damp became a death sentence. But fire damp was only half the danger. The other was coal dust. When coal is cut and crushed, it produces fine particles that hang in the air like a cloud. Mix that dust with methane and a spark, and you don't just get an explosion, you get a chain reaction that tears through every tunnel simultaneously. Mining engineers in 1913 knew about these dangers. Methods existed to dampen coal dust and improve ventilation. Water sprays and stone dust could have dramatically reduced the risk, but these methods cost money. And the Universal Colliery, owned by the Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries Company, was a business. Profits came first. Safety came second, if it came at all. Here is a fact that makes the 1913 disaster even more unbearable. This was not the first time Senghenydd burned. In May 1901, an explosion tore through the same colliery, killing 81 men and boys, 81 lives lost, families destroyed, a community left in ruins. Inquiries were held, reports were written, recommendations were made, and then almost nothing changed. The owners of the colliery paid a fine following the 1901 disaster that was so small it barely registered as a business expense. The government tightened some regulations on paper, but enforcement was inconsistent and inspections were infrequent. The miners had no real power to refuse work in dangerous conditions. Unions existed, but their influence over safety decisions was limited. So men went back underground. Boys followed their fathers. The dangerous gas kept building. The coal dust kept settling. And the company kept extracting coal and posting profits. 12 years later, the mountain sent its second warning, and this time, it did not hold back. Pront Yaz Leonardo AI. It was a Tuesday morning like any other in Senghenydd. The autumn air was cold and sharp. Lanterns flickered in the pre-dawn darkness as men pulled on their work clothes and women packed sandwiches into tin boxes. Children, still asleep in beds they had grown up in, unaware that the world was about to change forever. By 8 o'clock in the morning, over 900 men and boys had descended into the Universal Colliery. The day shift had begun. They spread out through miles of underground tunnels, their headlamps cutting thin lines through the blackness, the sound of their pickaxes and machinery creating the ordinary noise of labor. At 8:10 a.m., everything changed in an instant. A massive explosion ripped through the York section of the mine, a blast so powerful it was heard miles away above ground. The force of the detonation tore through tunnels, collapsed support beams, and sent a fireball racing through the shaft system. The men closest to the ignition point had no chance. Those further away faced a different, but equally horrifying fate, choking on carbon monoxide, the silent killer known to miners as afterdamp. The sound that reached the village above was unlike anything the residents had heard before. Even those who had lived through the 1901 explosion said this felt different, heavier, more final. Women ran from their homes towards the pithead, already knowing. The winding gear had stopped moving. No cages were rising. Smoke was pouring from the shaft entrance. Rescue teams from neighboring collieries arrived throughout the day, but what they found inside was almost impossible to comprehend. Miles of tunnels had collapsed. Bodies were scattered throughout the devastation. The heat from the initial explosion had started underground fires that complicated every rescue attempt. Carbon monoxide, the invisible, odorless gas produced after an explosion, had spread throughout the tunnels, silently killing men who had survived the initial blast. Many rescuers themselves had to retreat repeatedly, overcome by the toxic air. Some rescue teams lost members to the gas. The search for survivors became, hour by hour, a recovery of bodies. The community gathered at the pithead in the cold October air and waited. And waited. Very few survivors emerged. When the final count was made, 439 men and boys had lost their lives, making Senghenydd the deadliest coal mining disaster in British history. But numbers alone cannot capture what that meant for the village. Senghenydd had a population of only a few thousand people. In a single morning, nearly every family in the village had lost someone. Fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, uncles. Entire male lineages wiped out in minutes. There were streets where every house was in mourning. There were women who lost a husband and 3 sons on the same morning. There were boys as young as 14 who died underground, just weeks into their first jobs. The youngest victim was 14 years old. The oldest was in his 60s. Welsh mining communities were tight-knit and deeply spiritual, and the grief that settled over Senghenydd in the days that followed the explosion was a collective wound that the village never fully recovered from. Funerals stretched on for weeks. The chapels were full every day. The sound of singing, that deep, mournful Welsh choral tradition, became the soundtrack of a community trying to hold itself together. In the days after the explosion, one of the largest rescue operations ever undertaken in a British mine began in earnest. Teams came from collieries across South Wales and beyond, bringing specialized breathing equipment and expertise. It was dangerous, exhausting, and often heartbreaking work. Rescuers wore primitive proto-respirators, early versions of the self-contained breathing apparatus that allowed them to work in carbon monoxide-filled tunnels for limited periods. But the equipment was unreliable, the tunnels were unstable, and the fires burning deep inside made progress slow and unpredictable. Some bodies were found in groups, suggesting men had gathered together in the dark, hoping rescue would come before the air gave out. Others were found alone, collapsed where they had been working. Personal items, photographs, pocket watches, the small tokens men carried underground, were collected alongside the dead and returned to families. Not all victims were recovered immediately. Some remained underground for weeks. A small number were never recovered at all, their resting place remaining the tunnel where they died, sealed underground forever. The official inquiry into the Senghenydd disaster was conducted in the months following the explosion. What it found painted a damning picture of corporate negligence. The immediate trigger of the explosion was almost certainly an electrical spark from a signaling system in the York district of the mine, a system that the colliery operators had been warned was potentially unsafe. That spark ignited methane gas that had accumulated in poorly ventilated areas. The resulting fireball then detonated the coal dust that had been allowed to settle throughout the tunnels. This two-stage explosion, gas followed by coal dust, is what gave the disaster its catastrophic scale. The inquiry also found that the ventilation system in the mine was inadequate, that coal dust had not been properly suppressed with water or stone dust, and that the management had been aware of dangerous gas accumulations before the explosion. Multiple safety regulations had been violated. The evidence was clear. And yet, when it came time for consequences, the company escaped with almost nothing. This is perhaps the most painful chapter in the story of Senghenydd, the almost complete absence of accountability. Edward Shaw, the manager of the Universal Colliery, was prosecuted for violations of the Coal Mines Act. He was found guilty. His punishment? A fine of £24. £24 for 439 deaths. That works out to just over 1 shilling per life. The company itself, Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries, was fined just under £10 for separate violations. Together, the total financial penalty paid by those responsible for one of the worst industrial disasters in British history amounted to less than £35. Workers and families received no meaningful compensation. There was no corporate manslaughter prosecution. No one went to prison. No senior executive faced serious consequences. In fact, the coal kept being mined at Senghenydd for decades after the disaster, as if nothing had happened. The legal system of Edwardian Britain sent a clear message to mining companies across the country. You could kill hundreds of workers, and the price would be less than the cost of a good suit. History often focuses on the men who died in industrial disasters, but the Senghenydd catastrophe created another tragedy that received far less attention: the hundreds of women and children left to survive without husbands and fathers in a world that offered them almost no support. In 1913, there was no welfare state, no survivor's pension, no meaningful life insurance for miners. Women who lost their husbands faced immediate financial destitution. Charitable relief funds were established, and donations poured in from across Britain and internationally. But these funds were administered paternalistically, with committees deciding how much each family deserved, and often attaching conditions to payments. Widows were expected to grieve quietly and be grateful for whatever they received. Many were forced to take in lodgers, to send their older children into domestic service or other work, and to stretch every penny to its absolute limit, just to survive. Older children, some barely teenagers, took on adult responsibilities overnight. The women of Senghenydd endured their grief largely in silence, carrying the weight of the disaster for the rest of their lives without recognition or compensation. For much of the 20th century, Senghenydd was a largely forgotten disaster. It was overshadowed by the First World War, which began just months later and consumed the attention of an entire generation. Communities like Senghenydd faced a double grief, losing men to the mine in October 1913, then losing more men to the trenches of France and Belgium in the years that followed. But in recent decades, a quiet movement has grown to ensure Senghenydd is remembered properly. A memorial garden was established in the village. A lamp recovered from the mine became a symbol of remembrance. Every year, on October 14th, the community gathers to read the names of the 439 dead. The names are not just numbers. They are real men and boys. Thomas, William, Evan, David, John. Names that echo the Welsh valleys and the families who built those communities. Today, the Universal Colliery site is long since closed. The shafts are sealed, the winding towers are gone. But the memorial stands, and the story is kept alive by descendants of survivors, by local historians, and by people who believe that the working people who died underground deserve to be remembered as loudly as any other victims of history. Create a powerful, respectful, and emotional illustration inspired by the Senghenydd mining disaster of 1913. Show the legacy of the tragedy, a quiet memorial garden in a Welsh village with soft autumn lighting, a glowing lamp from the mine, and plaques or markers with names representing the 439 men and boys who never returned. Include subtle symbols of mining safety and workers' rights, such as hard hats or safety signs, reflecting the lessons learned from the disaster. The atmosphere should convey remembrance, justice, and reflection, with distant Welsh valleys in the background. Realistic yet evocative style, suitable for historical and commemorative storytelling.